Welcome to the third and last segment of the program. In this segment, I have my guest in studio, a famous political economic analyst, Sultan Ali Haider. Sultan, welcome to the program.
Many thanks, Shabahat.
Tell us about this vaccine diplomacy of China. It has become a major headline of international media outlets. Can you enlighten us a bit about it?
So first of all, the most interesting aspect is that the word diplomacy has been associated to that, right? Which, if you think in itself, means that there's some ulterior motive behind all of what is happening in terms of sharing vaccines, doing research. It all goes back to, if we start, a disease started. It happened to start in China. However, instead of seeing China as a victim, the world sort of started blaming China, so it's blame the victim. So calling it the Chinese virus and things like that, rather than world coming to aid
Donald
China.
Trump took a lead on that.
Exactly. So in response to that, last year what started happening was that while China very aggressively went in and controlled its virus, it started sending out masks, for example, right? Masks were in great demand. China had the production facilities. And then that is the time when we saw the first reaction, the world reacting, or rather the Western world reacting to that negatively. So that in the third world, or for some neutral people, that was quite strange, China is doing something nice. Why is the Western world reacting to that? The issue is that the Western world saw that they had vacated this empty space where it was the Western world which would come as a savior to the rest of the world. And China was doing that while the Western world could not do that. Rather, China was sending it to Europe, which is a developed world. That is where this whole concept started. And it was the West's reaction to China occupying that space. And now again, so fast forward to 2021, China is sending its vaccines, but now the Western world is also competing. And who sends the vaccine to who first? That is the whole game which is happening.
So what is actually happening behind the curtain, and how do you think it is going to affect the global politics?
So behind the curtain, what is happening is that now, as your program's title says, Faultlines, so now we have a fresh fault line on vaccines. Nobody thought of it before, on health issues. So it is seen as a competition. Whoever can produce the vaccines faster, whose vaccine is better, and who can get the vaccines faster to others, who is suffering but is still able to help others. So those are the fault lines which are in place, and that is where the whole game is being played. So for example, when the virus hit, China was the victim, but then China was able to overcome. US, when it hit the US, the death rate in US spiked up. Initially it was Europe, then US went way ahead. So it was whether US can control the pandemic, right? It was resilience of United States.
We'll come to US in the later question, but as you said,
Yeah.
initially the West had blamed that there's a curtain on information in China. It's not as good as it's told, but then we have heard that China is entirely open. They are operating in a normal lifetime. So how do you comment on this?
So it's essentially a war of narratives, right? So I think one doesn't need to get too much into that, but it's what you are saying versus what I'm saying. So in terms of reality, as you are saying, China wasn't as bad. So they doubted whether China was doing really good. So irrespective of whatever facts on the ground, but yes, China was still functioning, right? So it wasn't that there was a complete blackout of information, right? So again, that is why one should not be reading too much into these things. And what we should be looking at is in terms of what are the actual facts on ground, and then we can build from that. If you can put up the first exhibit on the screen. Now, if you look at that, 14 of the vaccines are approved globally. So now the data that I'm sharing is from UNICEF, right, and World Health Organization. And 21 billion doses are to be produced. Globally, out of which countries have secured supplies of 10.6 billion vaccines, right? Of which 3.56 are for COVAX, which is essentially a consortium of vaccines funded by developed countries to go into the developed world, which cannot afford these. Now, and the price of vaccine is from $2 to $44. It's that range. So it tells you that there's enough supply coming to get you and me vaccinated 2-3 times over. right? So there isn't really a long-term issue on that, and that is where the diplomatic thing comes up.
So have United States and Europe been outsmarted by China when it comes to the global vaccination diplomacy?
I wouldn't say outsmarted. You may call it caught napping, like if you think of it from a political angle, it is right, there was this empty space, the West wasn't coming in, and China came and occupied that space. They were more enterprising. Rather, or in another way, what you can say is West thought that we will do and China and Russia will be waiting for us. China and Russia also invested, and they also developed the vaccines. Now, this is where the politics bits comes in, where US is very sensitive or the West is sensitive, or China or Russia may also be very sensitive. It is that who is the developed country, who is the leader, right? So if Russia is able to develop the vaccine on its own, China is able to develop it on its own. So rather than Western Europe going to Russia and Russia suffering and asking for help from its Western cousins, it is Russia which is supplying. So that is where its whole brand image, right, which is a stronger power. So that is the image and the war of narrative, because the other narrative of developed countries and developing countries, that is where it's get really
Sultan,
fractured.
Europe, United States, Russia, China have been the trendsetters in the world. It's nothing new. But now we are seeing India taking the lead. We are seeing United States giving a lead to India into the equation, and Australia and Japan becoming the financiers of the American-made vaccines to be established, to be made in India. How do you see this from your political economic angle?
So it is, disease doesn't know nationality, right, or gender or anything. So disease is spreading across the world. Now in disease and fighting the disease and vaccines, we are imposing the political map. So political map is, yes, China-US conflict, right, or US seeing China as gaining too much power, right, and replacing it. So then you have Quad, as you mentioned in the intro to your program. So it is China, Russia on one side, and you have United States trying to contain China, along with Japan, India, and Australia. So you are trying to, or they are trying to impose that. So now how do you compete for influence in this region? It is you get the factories based in India, you boost their capacity, you fund them, you buy vaccines from them, and then get those vaccines to be supplied to other countries. Interesting, what is happening in India at this point in time is that it's sort of competing interest, right? It can vaccinate its own population, while at the same time it can send those vaccines to other countries and compete with China. So for example, the flashpoints were you had Sri Lanka as a flashpoint, you had Bangladesh as a flashpoint, you had Nepal as a flashpoint.
China already giving vaccines to 45 countries. India has just begun.
Yes, but it is one country picking up either India's vaccine or China's. Who is the savior, right? So this is where the politics bit is coming in. Had this politics bit not started 1 year back, then it would have been very interesting. It would have been a very benign thing. It is something like there's this match or competition going on, whether media is putting some attention to that or not. So now it has become a very interesting match from that.
So how it is going to go forward from this point onward? We have so far discussed whatever has already happened and is already known to the public. We have analyzed it a bit, but how do you foresee things going forward from here?
So if you can put up the second graph, which is about the vaccine production, right? So we can see that 7.4 billion vaccines are to be produced in the first half of 2021. Another 13.8 billion in the second half of 2021, right? Next year going forward, capacity is going to be 37 billion onward, right? So there are going to be ample vaccination. Another very critical point to understand is, I've heard some of the American analysts talking about it, technical analysts, not political analysts. It is that at the end of the day, the vaccine is supposed to protect you, number one, from death, number two, from hospitalization. So if you break it down from political angle, let's look at it from Pakistan or any other developing country, right? We want to protect our population from death rate, right? So we want to lower the death rate. Number two, we want to reduce the load on hospitals in terms of ICUs. So even if you have vaccines from ABC, any other origin, which has lower efficacy, 60-65%, efficacy is in terms of deaths. It's not in terms of impact. So in terms of having its impact in reducing the severity of the illness, right? That brings the political context. So the greatest political impact going forward will be that developing country realizing, number one, they're very important, right? Because West is trying to quote them, China is trying to quote them, Russia is trying to quote them. They're also realizing they're very important markets because all of them are trying to get their orders. They have developed their vaccines. Now they want markets to sell those vaccines, right? So I think one interesting outcome can be countries realizing, African countries realizing they're very important. Other Asian countries,
they're all important markets.
They're a very important market. If you read analysts from the US, they will be trying to portray, you read Bloomberg, it will be like China is evil, it's using this, to convince. When I read that, I was like, okay, so if US was doing that, so US also had ulterior motives for the last 50, 60 years, when it was doing all of the good things, right? So it will be very interesting. I think third world would, in diplomatic context, political context, they'll become more aware of their importance.
Thank you very much, Sultan, once again for being in this program. You are always very enlightening.